I'm Billy S, welcome back to the channel. Last week we talked about the best features from each Soulsborne game, while this week we're flipping the hourglass, as I talk about the worst features from each Soulsborne game. Because for every good aspect of these titles, there's always the other side of the coin, hiding in the shadows until those darned video essayists show up. I'm not going to beat around the bush, I'm just going to ask you to parry that subscribe button to stay up to date on my latest videos. So without further ado, the best features in every Soulsborne game, ranked. Let me know your least favourite part of every game down below. For Demon Souls, you might be expecting me to talk about world tendency. After all, it's an obtuse system that is poorly explained by the game and practically requires a guide for new players to get the most out of it. For example, why is it a punishment for players to be in human form when exploring the lands of Boletaria? If you die at any point while human, your world tendency shifts to black, which makes enemies harder and has the potential to spawn in red phantoms, so you're encouraged to stay in spirit form from the entire game, suiciding in the Nexus after defeating every boss, and basically being required to use the Cling Ring to have a decent amount of HP. This is annoying, but it's something you can adapt to, and the world tendency acting as a difficulty slider for each zone can be a fun challenge. If we're talking things that genuinely annoy me in Demon Souls though, look no further than the humble inventory weight system. Developed as a response to make healing consumables have no limits, every item you pick up will increase your character's inventory weight, and the only way to ease your burden is to either throw items out or visit Stockpile Thomas in the Nexus. What this means is that if you're mid-level, you've found some good upgrade materials, and you find yourself overburdened, you have no option but to walk back to the Nexus and give your stuff to Thomas before heading back out. And as there are no mid-level teleports, it means starting the level you were just dealing with from the very beginning. I'm not a particular fan of features that inherently halt a player's progress to the point where game flow is ruined, and I'm glad that inventory weight was booted for future games. All it took was making healing consumables a non-stackable resource, and heck, Dark Souls 2 brought back the 99 stacks of life gems, and that game still finds a way to be one of the hardest in the series for new players. So what was even the point of inventory weight? Moving on to Dark Souls, I decided not to bash the very obvious flaws the game has, because do I want to be yet another video essayist complaining about how the second half of the game was never finished, leading to rather underwhelming areas like Lost Izalith and Tomb of the Giants? Everyone's done that before, and while I don't like either of these zones particularly, there's another feature of Dark Souls that I have personal beef with. Longtime viewers know how much I dislike the concept of instant death. I've got so much to say about Death Blight in Elden Ring, for example, but let's flip the script and go back to when it was first brought into the world. Curse from Dark Souls. If you're unlucky enough to find yourself killed by either a basilisk smoke or Seath's absolutely hitbox-fucked crystals, there's a chance you'll end up feeling the pain of Curse. Dying to the build-up of Curse can be devastating for the player, as unlike the other games in the series, you have serious consequences in Dark Souls 1. To begin with, you have a permanent 50% reduction to your HP for as long as you remain cursed, which can be extremely brutal depending on the portion of the game you're in. If it's early, a 50% health reduction could leave you getting one shot by every enemy you encounter. It's also impossible for you to reverse your hollowing or kindle at bonfires, so you won't be able to boost your Estus from the location you're in. And because you can't reverse hollowing, it means you can't summon before boss fights. But hey, you can hit the ghosts in New Londo, that's fun! Now to be fair, it's possible to receive Purging Stones from Oswald of Karim after beating the Gargoyles, or from the Undead Merchant in the waterway near Firelink Shrine, which costs 3,000 and 6,000 souls from each vendor respectively. But imagine being a new player with no concept of what curse is or how to stop it. Perhaps your name is Billy S and it's 2015, and you're cursed in the depths and you don't have any knowledge about purging stones. So your best friend Nathan just tells you, go see Ingvard in New Londo. He can heal it. So you run through the fucking ghost level, and of course, he's on top of the bloody ghost house. Madre mierda, Nathan. For Dark Souls 2, I'm surprised that for this entry I'm not talking about this game's hollowing system. See, in Dark Souls 2, every time you die, you go a little more hollow. This is a narrative device explained in the opening cutscene, as when you're afflicted by the curse of the undead, you'll die, and die again until you lose your sense of self. This is shown in gameplay in two ways. Firstly, your appearance degrades with every death, to the point where you look like a shriveled old prune. And secondly, every death will remove 5% of your maximum health points to a cap of 50%. And this is permanent unless you use a human effigy to regain your humanity. You can find the Ring of Binding in Hyde's Tower of Flame to reduce this effect, and if this is all sounding familiar, it's because this is a slightly tamer version of Demon Souls' human and spirit form mechanic, even down to this game having a version of the Cling Ring. Arguably, Demon Souls did it worse, but Dark Souls 2 is the harder game, which means dying is more often than not going to happen here. But the hollowing system isn't what's going to fuck you up in an early run of Dark Souls 2. Instead, you have to contend with an entirely obtuse mechanic in the form of the, let's say it on 3, 1, 2, 3, adaptability stat. You know how in every Souls game, your ability to dodge through attacks is often determined by whether you're light, medium, or heavy load based on your equipment weight? Dark Souls 2 said fuck that system and tied the iframes of your dodge to the adaptability stat. You actively start Dark Souls 2 with a worse dodge than Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, forcing you to adopt the shield and pray strategy until you can get your adaptability to at least level 20. Adaptability raises your poise and agility, alongside poison and bleed resistance, and those first two are vital. Most players swear by getting your agility to a 110, and if you're good at Dark Souls, this won't take terribly long due to the crazy amounts of leveling you do in the early game, but the fact you have to spend vital levels just to put yourself on the same pedestal that other games start you with is just incredibly unfun. This is why you see people saying that Dark Souls 2 is the slowest game in the series, because dodges feel sluggish compared to every other game, yet it's adaptability that's been causing this all along. For Bloodborne, you might expect me to bring up Frenzy, a status effect often built by the Winter Lanterns that, when maxed out, causes you a ton of damage based on your amount of insight. But I'm a masochist who actually likes the frenzy mechanic. It's rare enough that it doesn't really bother me. Instead, I'm going to beat a dead horse. Demon Souls also has this upcoming issue, but for Bloodborne, it is way more of a problem. Blood vial farming. Like Demon Souls, Bloodborne doesn't give the player a renewable form of healing like an Estus flask when you die. Your healing comes in the form of blood vials, which you can collect either as pickups found in levels, or from the various enemies you slay on your journey through Yharnam, with the central part of the town being an absolute hotspot. Ask any Bloodborne player and they'll tell you about their various blood vial farming spots because we've all had to do it at one point or another. But why do we farm blood vials? Quite simply, it's because while you can buy blood vials from the Hunter's Dream, they suffer from the effects of inflation, and like penny sweets from the early 2000s or the cost of a Freddo chocolate bar, these fuckers get pricier as the game continues, to the point where it's detrimental to buy from the Dream. It's easier to just put on a podcast and farm for 45 minutes in central Yharnam doing the same routes over and over again, which is something that will happen on a first playthrough. It doesn't matter who you are, you won't be able to avoid this. Experienced players are often much better at the game now, which means less deaths and less blood vials used. And if you have online, you can use the infamous Come for Puka chalice to farm blood echoes to buy all the vials you want. But as someone who very rarely plays Bloodborne with online mechanics because PS Plus is expensive, that's just not my experience. Having to stop the momentum of my playthrough to farm, most likely when I'm throwing myself against a tough boss, like Martyr Leggatt for example, is one of the most frustrating things I've experienced in Bloodborne. Thank God I am over that hurdle for now, but I feel for anyone starting this game for the first time. For Dark Souls 3, this is going to be a tad more vague than the rest of the entries on this list, because for all intents and purposes, Dark Souls 3 is a great game with some stellar design, fluid gameplay, and a real visual identity, even if I can't stand the dreary, desaturated energy of its dying world. But there is something about the stretch of game between the Undead Settlement and Farron Swamp that really tests me every time I replay the game. So I'm dubbing this segment Complexity and Linearity. Dark Souls 3 is an inherently linear experience. You go from area to area, with one or two offshoots as you go that you need to explore before pressing on. Cathedral of the Deep, Smouldering Lake, Consumed King's Garden. This is in stark comparison to Dark Souls 2, where you have 4 entirely different directions you can go in from the game's beginning, or Dark Souls 1, where you have 2 different objectives you can chase from the get-go if you have the Master Key. Because of this, replaying Dark Souls 3 feels the most like going through the motions. I'm a player that likes to explore every zone to completion, collect every item, fight every enemy, because in previous games, no matter how many times I replay them, it still gives me a sense of excitement and enjoyment. With Dark Souls 3, when I try to do this, I end up feeling far more fatigued than the other games, and it took me a long time to figure out why I felt that way. After all, High Wall of Lothric, the Undead Settlement, and Cathedral of the Deep are all inherently well-designed locations, and I've always been a fan of Farron Keep, even if most people despise it. But then I came to a realization. We haven't had a game up to this point in the series that introduced multiple massive areas with complex level layouts so early in the game. Dark Souls areas were all relatively small, making more use of the game's verticality to provide extra paths and shortcuts. Dark Souls 2 did have the Forest of Fallen Giants, but if you then go to Hyde's Tower of Flame, things kinda level out. Dark Souls 2's level design is also more linear than that of Dark Souls 3, which allows for an ease of progression. Dark Souls 3 though, High Wall of Lothric is perfectly fine. It has the right amount of optional content on top of the mandatory path, that you feel like you have a fun time exploring here. Then you get to the Undead Settlement. There are so many little offshoots to explore, so much verticality to this one zone, and it really does feel like it goes on forever with countless extra paths when you think you're done. It tips past the point of being fun and more into being exhausting to clean this area out. Then follow that up with the Crucifixion Woods and the slow swamp water with the crabs beating you up, and then the extremely slow Farron Keep progression, and even Cathedral of the Deep, a really well-designed singular area, feels like it goes on for a little too long, and ends up being mandatory as well. Does anybody else feel this way? Like Dark Souls 3 didn't ease you in correctly and just decided to go with the convoluted, complicated level design from the get-go? I really need validation on this one, I won't lie. For Sekiro, this will likely be one of the quicker segments in the video because I only have one aspect of this game I cannot stand, and it's quite simply questline progression. More so than any other games in the series, the events that need to be triggered in order to get specific endings or access specific parts of the game feel so much more obtuse in Sekiro. And all of this comes back to a system that I feel was both underutilized and unintuitive: eavesdropping. At the start of the game, you get a ton of moments where you can eavesdrop on the various guards in the reservoir or the outskirts, which helps you to learn vital information. I wish this was a concept used throughout the game, as the later you get into Sekiro's experience, the less often you come across these eavesdropping moments. I don't think there are any fun eavesdrop moments in Meevee Village or the Sunken Valley, for example. I could be wrong, but the fact I don't remember any of them is a real shame. Instead, eavesdropping is used to progress quest lines involving Emma, Kuro, the Sculptor, and the Divine Child of the Rejuvenating Waters. When do you need to eavesdrop on these people? It's never fucking clear. Oh, you need to hide in the back of Kuro's room to listen to him and Emma? Oh, you need to run behind the Sculptor's temple to listen to Emma talk about Sekiro dying depending on his chosen ending? Without a guide, there is absolutely no way I, as a player, would have been able to access the Hirata Estate revisit in this game, thus depriving myself of the Owl Father fight, much less earning the requirements for the return ending, which is itself my least favourite questline in Sekiro from a gameplay perspective. Given this is a single-player game, I do wish there were more hints towards how to achieve certain endings, beyond getting lucky and finding the required eavesdrop locations, or just going online and looking up a guide. I'm not saying have like a quest log or anything in the game, but just there had to be some way to make this a tad less obtuse. Lastly, Elden Ring, another easy entry for me. Dare I say, I am completely open-worlded out. Exploring the lands between and the Land of Shadow was a journey I'll never forget, and I can't see how FromSoft will be able to top this open world in their next game, so how about we just don't? The main reason I feel this way is because of Elden Ring's biggest issue, the flagrant reuse of boss fights. I've been on both sides of this argument at one point or another. When the game first came out, I defended the different opportunities to refight some of the cooler bosses in the game. But last year, after recording the game in its entirety, every boss and all, I ended up wishing that FromSoft had shown some restraint. Ah yes, the Red Wolf of Radagon and his 3 brothers in Mount Gelmir, Karyamana, and Nokron. Ah yes, the copious amounts of ulcerated tree spirits that lay in wait at the bottom of catacombs. Ah yes, let's use the cemetery shade 3 times, and let's throw multiple tree sentinels at the player across the game, and let's throw a fuck ton of dragons your way that truly do feel like flavored reskins. I'm not saying I don't enjoy boss fights in Elden Ring, I really do. Even the ones I'm ragging on about now. But when I replay this game, I want to experience the highlights. Margit, Godfrey, Renala, Mohg, Morgott, Malekith, Melania, Godric, Rykard, Radagon, even Elden Beast. I find myself wishing that Elden Ring was structured like the older games and didn't have to dedicate as much time in the open world so that I could enjoy the encounters in the legacy dungeons that I love. This is a topic people will inherently disagree with, and fair play to anyone who's in favour of more and more bosses and larger open worlds. I actually think, though, the DLC is a more replayable campaign than the base game because the world is a lot smaller and a majority of the fights feel unique. We're not running into Masmar in an Everjail or Relena, the hidden third sister of the Karian royal family. At most, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion gets a refight, and he was the first battle in the DLC, so I'm fine with it. But then the base game has you fight Mohg 2 separate times, Godfrey's first phase twice if you include Golden Shade, Beast Clergyman is an encounter in Dragon Barrow, I've already touched on the Red Wolf, and God forbid we bring in Godfroy. It's simply my preference that I prefer games with less boss fights that are unique and well designed, over games with more boss fights that get reused and often just have their damage buffed up as the way to pad the difficulty. And I'll be very curious to see how many people disagree with me in the comments. And that's my list. Which of these is the one that you agree the most with? Let me know down below, and be sure to parry that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all my future videos. A massive shout out to my YouTube channel members for supporting me for another month. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much. It's $4.99 a month. You get early access to future videos. It's great. And if you want to follow me, check out my Blue Sky. I've deleted my Twitter. It is gone. Goodbye. I'll see you next time. Adios.